When we're talking about nuclear reactions, there are two main ways that we can gain energy. One is through fission. And fission is when we take a larger nucleus and break it down into smaller parts, smaller nuclei. And this usually happens when we have a reaction with a neutron. The other way that we can gain energy is called fusion. And fusion, like we're fusing together or gluing together, we take small nuclei and we smash them together in order to make a nucleus that is larger. And both of these reactions release huge amounts of energy. So fusion releases more energy per gram than fission does. In order to have fission, we have to have something that is fissionable, which means that it has to continue on in a chain reaction. And so we've talked about uranium-238 previously. However, when we have naturally occurring uranium, it contains very small amounts of uranium-235. And so uranium-235 is a fissionable isotope. What that means is it's going to undergo that chain reaction, but we have to enrich the uranium. We have to increase the amount of 235 available. In order to enrich it, generally what we have to do is put it into a centrifuge, because chemically they're identical, but mass-wise they are different. So if you've ever heard of a nuclear centrifuge, that is why, because we have to separate the uranium-235 so that it is in a larger percentage compared to the uranium-238. We then call the leftover material, uranium-238, we call that depleted uranium. So depleted uranium is a byproduct. Sometimes they use it in weapons because it's so heavy that it has good accuracy when being used as a projectile. So fission is a chain reaction. We take a neutron, we bombard it into a sample of uranium-235, and as that decays, produces energy, and it also produces 3 new neutrons. Those 3 new neutrons are able to go and interact with the next uranium and produce even more neutrons, and we get this cascade effect where we are continually increasing our reaction, producing a chain reaction. In a nuclear reactor, the way that we use uranium-235 is we use it in fuel rods. The fuel rods are contained in a reactor core. Inside the reactor core, we have control rods, and we'll explain what those are in just a minute. But those, as they react and produce the chain reaction, the energy is used to produce steam. So we produce steam. That steam is used to turn a turbine and produce electricity. Now there are many benefits to using nuclear power in that it is a very efficient reaction and produces lots of energy. In the reactor core, with our fuel rods, we do have to have a way to control our chemical reaction, because as we explained before, it is a cascade, a chain reaction that continues to get larger and larger. So the way that we control it is we use something called control rods, which actually absorb neutrons. By absorbing the neutrons, it takes away our reactants that produces the fission, and it allows the rate that our nuclear reactions are happening to be controlled. And so our control rods are an essential part of keeping nuclear energy safe. So what are the advantages of nuclear? Well, nuclear energy requires a lot less fuel. About 50 kilograms of fuel generates enough electricity for 1 million people. The other benefit is there is no air pollution because we are not producing any combustion reactions. We're producing steam from the water that surrounds our nuclear reactor core. If we compare that to coal burning power plants, it takes about 2 million kilograms of fuel in order to produce the same amount of electricity. And we produce NOx and SOx. So we produce nitrogen dioxide and sulfur oxide containing compounds, which when they react with the water in the atmosphere, produce nitric acid and sulfuric acid, decreasing the pH of the water and producing acid rain. The other byproduct of burning coal, because coal is a carbon source, we produce carbon dioxide, which adds to the greenhouse effect and can produce climate change. There are some problems with nuclear power, however, and when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. One of the problems that can happen is if the excess energy is not controlled through the continual motion of or continual pumping of the water through our reactor core, that heat builds up and starts melting through our reactor core. And then we get a core meltdown, just like happened in Chernobyl, in the USSR, or at Fukushima, which is in Japan, that happened because of the tsunami that occurred. And these were both very devastating to the environment surrounding these plants. Another problem is waste disposal. So the waste that is produced from our fuel rods remains radioactive and has a very long half-life. And so we need to figure out a way to either get rid of this waste or store it. And so there's been lots of research and lots of ways to try and think about how we're going to deal with the leftover waste. Currently, it is stored at the nuclear power plant where it is produced. So they keep them in large silos that are heavily shielded, and it is stored there. There was a facility that they were trying to build in the Yucca Mountains in Nevada to store the country's entire supply of spent nuclear rods. However, this got derailed because they were unsure as to how they were going to market and keep the storage facility safe. There was a Blue Ribbon Commission on America's nuclear future that was commissioned by President Obama to look at how we could potentially store and handle the waste that was produced from nuclear power. So where does this energy come from? So we know that there's a large amount of energy that's produced, a lot of heat, but where does it come from? Well, it comes from one of the most famous equations in science, E equals mc squared. So E is the energy, and that is equal to the mass times the speed of light squared. E equals mc squared. And so the amount of energy that uranium-235 can produce is about 1.7 times 10 to the 13th joules of energy. So it's a huge amount of energy from a fairly small amount of material. So what is that mass? So we know energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. What is the mass? Well, the mass is actually the difference between what our reactants weigh in atomic mass units and the products that are produced. There is a small difference in atomic mass units, about 0.18489 atomic mass units. And when we turn that into kilograms, that is the mass in our E equals mc squared. And we can calculate the amount of energy for one uranium atom. It is 2.7593 times 10 to the negative 11 joules. So when we take that to a mole, we get a very large amount of energy. How about when we look at fusion? So up until this point we talked about fission. Now this is fusion. Fusion is, remember, when we take two nuclei and slam them together and make a larger nucleus. This is what happens in the sun. We take small atoms like hydrogen and helium and slam them together to get larger atoms. So, same type of idea. We look at the difference between the mass of our reactants and the mass of the products. And this is what's called the mass defect, that difference between the two. We also look at the energy that is released. We call that binding energy. And there's some conversions that we can use to get from millielectron volts to joules, and from AMUs to a millielectron volts. So if we look at fusion, here we have two hydrogen atoms and two neutrons that are being bound together to make helium. And again, this is the reaction that happens in the sun. And we have a mass defect of 0.03 and a binding energy that is produced from that mass defect of 2.7 times 10 to the 13th joules per mole for our hydrogen. Fusion occurs for small atomic mass numbers, and it occurs for elements from hydrogen up to iron. And this is where the source of energy comes from in our sun and also other stars. Once we get to iron, the amount of energy that it takes in order to fuse our nuclei together becomes more than the energy that is produced from the nuclear reaction. And so this is why stars tend to have iron cores, because this is where the reaction levels out or goes to completion for fusion. So our most stable elements are centered around iron. Once we get into larger elements, then they can undergo fission and break down into elements that are centered around iron.